Hello, everyone. We'll be getting started in just a moment. I know we saw people signing in, and I know this is a program that's a little earlier than usual, but it's a long night for our guests tonight. So I'm going to go ahead and get started with our introduction. Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us tonight for our latest author discussion. Tonight, I am pleased to introduce tonight's speaker, Bradley Hope, who is the author of the new book, The Rebel and the Kingdom, the true story of the secret mission to overthrow the North Korean regime. And as you can tell from all my little post-its, I have thoroughly read this book, and it is in my top favorite books, actually, of 2022. For those of you who are new to our virtual programs, welcome. And tonight's program is just one of our many upcoming author events. Next Monday, we're excited to host the director of the Victoria and Albert Museum. His name is Tristram Hunt. He'll be discussing the life of the famed artist Josiah Wedgwood. You may be aware of his pottery. We'll also be hosting President Ronald Reagan's daughter, Patty Davis, on November 14th to discuss her book, Floating in the Deep End, which is a supportive resource for anyone who's a caregiver or has been impacted by Alzheimer's. We'll also have royal biographer Andrew Morton on November 28th to discuss his newest biography, The Queen, Her Life, which is an examination of the late Queen Elizabeth II's life. For a full list and to register for anything, just visit our website, hudsonlibrary.org. Now, if you have any questions throughout tonight's discussion, please use the Q&A box. It's going to be located at the bottom of your screen, and we're going to try to get through as many questions as time permits. Also, copies of The Rebel and the Kingdom are available for purchase, courtesy of our local bookstore, The Learned Owl. We'll put a link in the chat for easy purchase. And again, like I said, I highly recommend this one. Now, I would like to introduce tonight's guest. Bradley Hope is a New York Times bestselling author, Pulitzer Prize finalist, and Gerald Loeb Award winner. His previous books include Billion Dollar Whale and Blood and Oil. Blood and Oil is another fantastic book that I read. And he is the co-founder of Project Brazen, a global journalism studio and production company that specializes in delivering thrilling stories through podcasts, books, documentaries, as well as other types of media. So without further ado, Bradley, I'd like to thank you so much for joining us this evening. I know it's a little late because you're in London, if I'm correct.
Yes, thank you. No, I'm very happy to be here. I'm glad to be talking to you.
Great. And so I know that when we listen to the news anymore, oftentimes, North Korea will come up, and it normally comes up for only a few different types of topics, such as sanctions, foreign policy, and missile strikes. And I know you're not a North Korean expert per se, but you do overlap both the history and the unfolding events of some activists that we'll talk about in this book later tonight, Adrian Hong, Christopher Ahn. But you also really provide a great beginning understanding of North Korea, and the complexities and differentiations between the two Koreas. So I was hoping we could take a little bit of time first to explain the history of North Korea a little bit and why it is what it is. So the one thing I think is really interesting is the philosophy of Juche, and how that is really a fundamental idea in North Korea. Could you explain what that is and how that's kind of used to keep everyone kind of in control?
Yeah, I mean it's quite interesting. A lot of the kind of weird things that exist in the world today, they're the result of a kind of series of small decisions that nobody knew the consequences of at the time. So even the boundary between North and South Korea was sort of just decided by a couple of young guys in the White House in the final days of World War II. And it was the least of anyone's mind. This wasn't like a major point of contention. It was just one of the many decisions that had to be made that night, and they just chose a particular latitude to make that decision. And so North Korea is also, in my mind, it's kind of what happens when a philosophy or a doctrine, in this case, Marxism and the socialist thinking that came out of the Soviet Union, merged with like a kind of maniacal character. So what happened was Kim Il-sung, the founder of North Korea, he was obviously kind of came out of that moment. He was sort of chosen by the Soviet Union to be the sort of proxy leader of North Korea on their behalf. But over time, he became his own personal quirks and his own personality began to infuse that form of leadership. It no longer became a kind of vassal or a proxy state for the Soviet Union. And obviously, Korea has an amazing, deep, rich history as well that fed into it. And it sort of became this almost like, you know, his own status became almost like a deity, obviously by his own design, right? And his own history was rewritten and erased to make him into sort of this magical figure. So Juche was this concept that came out of that ferment at the time, where it almost kind of justifies what we see today. North Korea's kind of obstinate stance towards the rest of the world, that we have to rely on ourselves. And it really kind of goes to this self-reliance concept. Even if we have to live in an impoverished state, of which North Korea would never admit that they're in an impoverished state, but even if they have to live through difficulties, it's better because at least we can be in charge of our own country, our own destiny.
Right. And obviously the North Korea is frequently referred to as the hermit kingdom. They are considered to be very isolated from the rest of the world, which is partially true. And also, you know, sometimes surprisingly, you might be surprised to learn some areas where they are in the world. Now, as you were mentioning, the Juche is kind of a nice explanation, but there's also another thing that holds still to, so for example, a child born in North Korea today still has a mark on them essentially based on their ancestors, and that's called the songbun, correct?
Yes, exactly. Another kind of weird thing that sort of it's a mixture. There was a kind of a period of time in North Korea, especially when Kim Il Sung was solidifying his control, where there was purges of people with certain backgrounds. For example, people whose family members had Christian missionaries or prominent Christian leaders, for example, they were considered of a lower quality of North Koreans because they have this outside influence, and other things too. Capitalists, people who were landowners, they all were kind of marked down. And at the time, in the earlier days, there was no formalized system for this. It was just kind of like a almost more, you know, a top-down decision making around who's important and who's not, and who could get jobs and who can't. But over time, that's the kind of the crazy thing about North Korea. Is over time, all of these quirks of Kim Il Sung and his kind of top leadership became codified in this like almost bewildering and scary bureaucracy, you know. And so this songbun system is extremely complex. Even North Korean scholars are not experts on it because it's not like explained somewhere. You know, the only way we can find out about it is from defectors. But essentially, it means that when you're born, you have a mark on you, and you may never be able to rise above it. And there's sort of three classes. There's a top class who are, you know, obviously the elites. There's a very large kind of middle class who are essentially the kind of service sector of the country, and a lot of those people would live in big cities like Pyongyang, but they could never rise to a high level. They're never going to be powerful. But then the one that's the scariest is the lowest class, and those are people that, like we said before, they maybe 4 generations back they had a landowner in the family or something, and now those people are born into a kind of feudal nightmare where they barely eke by in the kind of hinterlands of North Korea where there's might not be electricity. It's almost like a kind of going back in time in a time machine.
Right. And so I'm just curious, I know that you said, you know, you're not necessarily an expert on Korean history. Is there any one class when we think of defectors that there's a greater proportion of that class that does try to defect than others?
Yeah, I would probably not be an expert to answer that completely, but I would say we've seen a mixture of those defectors over time. There's probably precious few from the top, and the reason for that is there's also a rule or kind of like a practice where a defector is like, let's say you're a high ranking person and you defect. Not only will 3 generations of your family be punished, perhaps sent to a prison camp where you live in like a dirt room and have to forage pieces of grass to live on and suffer unbelievable horrors that come straight out of World War II's worst atrocities. But you also are leaving a mark forever on your entire line in your family. So anybody born in that family will now be at that lower caste. And so I think we've seen over time quite a lot of people from sort of the lower level of that caste system, because they tend to be able to kind of get over the border, because they might live in those kind of less policed areas, and in a way they're probably not being paid attention to as much. And then but there have been people from every rank. There's been people like, there was the North Korean ambassador to the UK, for example. He's one of the most prominent defectors. There's also wealthy people have defected. And then there's been probably the largest number, that would be my guess, would be from that middle level, because it just seems that that's what I've been able to see from when I read the stories.
Right. And obviously there are a lot of risks and consequences. It's common sense about those who choose to defect. And if you do choose to defect and escape North Korea, you are in for a very long, perilous journey. And you outline that in great detail in the book, especially once Adrian's involved and his assistants. But could you outline just some of the basics that someone would face if they tried to escape, especially maybe through into China?
Yeah, so you would think, looking at a map, that the easiest place to go would be through South Korea, and also because South Korea grants a passport to anyone who enters the country from North Korea, because they consider all of Korea to be one nation still. So they consider North Koreans to be South Koreans, or to be Koreans, but that border is like one of the most intensely fortified, dangerous borders in the world. It's impossible to go into South Korea that way. So if you look at the map, it's China is the only way really to escape. And if you go into China, it's a very scary and long journey, because the Chinese government does not believe there are any North Korean defectors, in a sense, or anybody who can claim asylum. They deem every single person who leaves as an economic migrant, so that they're here for money or they're here for jobs. And so they instantly deport them back. So of course, being North Korean is actually very hard to blend in as well. You're culturally not, it's like they're being from another universe to some extent. So the journey is hard, because you would easily be picked out as a North Korean. There's just that simple threat. And then just the physical effort of getting across China to another border, because you can't fly out from China as well. So people go all the way to Thailand, they go all the way to Mongolia, and it's largely with the help of a kind of relatively secretive underground railroad that starts at the border region with these kind of shelters and charities that help identify North Koreans who've escaped. And then they take them on this long journey, and they've developed practices over the years to make it easier, and relationships, but it's very much an underground railroad.
Absolutely. And as like I said, we are kind of insular. We don't hear everything that goes on over there. But when we do hear about news articles such as the Global Human Rights Report that came out in the early 2000s, I remember I was in high school when that came out. We also had the famine that took place in the 1990s after the collapse of the Soviet Union. I can understand why then people will start becoming aware and involved. And that is where kind of some of your main characters in your book come in, that were activists that really, honestly, as we said beforehand, kind of do some mesmerizing things, even though they're not superheroes, until it kind of all comes crashing down. In this book mostly follows Adrian Hong, and he's a very enigmatic person. I mean, after reading this, I don't quite feel like I know him. Could you describe, as a journalist, how did you personally discover Adrian?
Sure. Well, I was a journalist. I covered the Arab Spring, in 2011, 2013. And one of the places I covered was Libya. And actually I was writing a kind of, I was on the eastern side of the country, and I was looking for some action, basically, because, as a reporter, you're trying to find out information about, at the time, the last battle was in the middle of the country. So it was pretty far from where I was. So I was taking this journey by car every day for hours to get closer and find out information. And I wrote this story about this 18-year-old Korean American kid, really, called Chris Jun, who had hitchhiked into Libya during his spring break to join the rebels. And that story went viral everywhere because it was just so unbelievable that somebody would do that. And I got an email at that time out of the blue from someone called Adrian Hong. And I was super interested. Who is this guy, writing me, claiming that he was coming to Libya. He wants to help the guy escape. And I was wondering, who is this person that would be, writing me? And I became fascinated with him because he had this something very compelling about him, like a sense of mission, but also very mysterious. And for many years that I knew him, I was always debating internally whether or not he was pretending or kind of exaggerating, or was he a spy, or what was he? I couldn't understand. He was always traveling. He kind of often wore a suit. He had something. He was very confident as well, and so that's how I got to know him. But it was kind of a journalistic relationship in the sense that we weren't like close friends or anything like that. And I would just meet him whenever I could because he seemed fascinating. He seemed connected to something that was going on. And in journalism, you often you pay a lot into these kind of relationships without really knowing where they're going to lead because you just have a feeling about that person. In this case, it sort of paid off journalistically, even though the story itself is not necessarily well, it's not complete, but it's also not that happy at this current stage.
Right. And if people in the audience today are not familiar with him, if you just do a simple YouTube search, you will find tons of videos that are 10, 15 years old, especially during his days when he was just a student at Yale, pretty much providing very educational lectures about the current state and social issues facing North Korea. It's actually quite fascinating at such a young age, how many even high-ranking people through our government he was able to meet, discuss, and even kind of like strategize at times, political and foreign policy.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, what's amazing. So the story of Adrian Hong is amazing because he arrived at Yale. He was the child of missionaries who were living in San Diego, and he came there with this hunger, an energy to do something. I talked to people that he knew in high school, and he wasn't really talking about North Korea. That wasn't his thing. He was still in search of that mission, and something about what was happening in the world at that time made him have that realization. And there's actually an interesting thing. I talked to a lot of Korean Americans who went to university around the same time, and there was a kind of at home in their families, they weren't really talking about North Korea in the way that you and I are talking about it right now. It's had a whole different context. One that I'm not an expert on, but in large part, there's a kind of shame about it. There's a kind of trauma around the division of the country. Many family members are left on either side of the border. And so that was kind of more the focus of that memory. And then they arrived at university and they had a kind of political awakening and they realized the true history of it. And at the same time, there was defectors starting to give testimony. And the testimony was so horrifying that it became clear to Adrian that there was no mission that would ever be greater for him than this one. And in a sense, on a human life's level, if human life is the guide for what's the biggest problem you could work on, it's fair to say this was definitely one of the biggest ones you could have ever worked on. Because if there's so many hundreds of thousands, I was reading, there's at least 100,000 to 120,000 inmates in political prison camps in North Korea at any given time. And those inmates have a life expectancy of 6 to 7 years once they enter the prison. So many of them are dying all the time, and their lives are ending early. So not to mention the fact that they're mistreated and that sort of thing. So anyways, Adrian was it seemed to him the clearest thing on earth that North Korea was the most pressing human rights crisis on earth. And but he never once deviated from that ever since he had that realization at campus. And what's fascinating is he created this group called Liberty in North Korea, which is now a major global organization. It just started off as like a student campus kind of group. They did amazing things, but he was always pushing further, and he actually outgrew that group very quickly. It was only a few years in that he said, "I'm going to leave now," and the group was actually shocked. They're like, "This is our founder. Like he's just going to leave." And it all came down to the fact that he just thought this group wasn't going to be active enough to make a difference for that huge population that are suffering. And if you look at the journey of Adrian, and that's really what the book does, is it explores almost the kind of radicalization of an activist who believes that this is a cause that's not receiving the attention, the effort, the resources that's needed, and combined with that is his almost, I mean, it's to me it's inspiring belief that a group of people can get together in a room, in a rec room, in a community center, and sort of make a decision to do something, and then it could have a huge impact on the world. And so a lot of the people that he gathered over the years started off as activists as well, but were inspired by that idea that they could make some sort of difference, even if they'd had no training whatsoever, you know?
Right, absolutely. And you're not over exaggerating when you say he kind of outgrew Link. I mean, I had to take notes about every group he formed when, okay, we leave this, we go to Pegasus and Chilima. Oh, now we're in Free Jocelyn. I mean, and each one seemed to have like a different mission. It was becoming more and more complex until, of course, everything tends to implode a little bit. And I think the conversation about students feeling kind of safe at college and having those conversations that they couldn't have at home is really important, because that kind of also introduces another person that has a very large role in the book, and that's Christopher An, who, depending on what you're reading, he can be labeled as an extremist who tried to overthrow a Korean government, or he's a US vet. So would you be able to explain a little bit about how Christopher and Adrian met, and how the two are kind of different in personality-wise a
Yeah,
little bit?
yeah. So Christopher An was he was a U.S. Marine, and he served in Iraq, and he came back from his tour of duty, you know, wanting to kind of start his life and start his career, but at the same time he had this sense of mission as well, and he wanted to be contributing his time in a way that was helping people. And he met Adrian through a mutual connection, and basically Christopher is the prototypical volunteer for Adrian Hong. He doesn't have the whole picture of what's going on. He's not part of even the strategy, right? He's not part of the secret discussions of what the plan is, but he's somebody that could get a phone call from Adrian at any time, and he would be there to help out. And most of the time, it was things like they were meeting with a defector, and they wanted to kind of put him at ease. And Christopher An, despite the images that you might find online of him, he looked quite tough, especially during the big Spain incident, which we'll talk about later, I'm sure. He looked tough with his sunglasses on. And in fact, Christopher An is one of the kindest, most gentle people I've ever met, actually, in reality. And so that was the role he played in the group. He was the kind of person to put you at ease, to build trust, and that sort of thing. And so Adrian was the kind of the visionary, the person holding all the risk on his shoulders with the ambition, and Christopher was more the volunteer. And he would never say for a second that he had any pretensions to being a mastermind of any of these plans. He was just a volunteer who would, on the weekends, really go and show up somewhere. During the week, he had a startup business. He went to business school during this time, but they're very different personalities. In a sense, they weren't even close friends, but they were bound by this sense of purpose.
It definitely had a sense of loyalty that was coming across throughout the book, a sense of bonding. So they are very different. And before we go into some of these high profile ones that Christopher is involved in, such as, the rescue of Kim Han-sol, so we will be talking a little bit about that. Adrian was involved in assisting with the smuggling of defectors in North Korea from a very early. He was still in college. He eventually even was arrested in China, which caused a bit of a domestic foreign policy kerfuffle. Could you talk a little bit about how, how did US delegates at that time perceive Adrian and what he was doing? Did they think he was just in the way? Did they think he was helpful?
I think for sure, nobody in a high level of the U.S. government has ever thought Adrian was helping out. In a sense, in a way, he's actually he's a thorn in the side of decision makers, because he's that thorn in the side, reminding you that you're not prioritizing the right thing. If you think about it at the highest level, politicians and the executive branch and Department of Defense, all of their calculations are abstract. They're and it's all game theory. It's about nuclear weapons. What if this guy does this and I do that, and then how do we trade? And even diplomacy can often just be so abstracted. And here's this activist who's saying, what about this guy right here? What about this family and this family and this person? Have you ever talked to one of these people? Have you ever seen what they've been through? And so he's just a reminder all the time that the priorities were askew from that true human compassion, you know. And I think he even he's a controversial figure even within the community that agrees with him, you know, because he was so aggressive in his and risk taking, you know. So yeah, even from a young age, he would. It's a good example how he got arrested. So George W. Bush made it possible for North Koreans to seek asylum in America much easier with the decision he made. He prioritized this idea of asylum seeking from North Korea. So Adrian didn't wait around, didn't ask permission. He flew to China. He found his group already had access to North Koreans who they were helping with these shelters along the border with North Korea and China. And he took one group and he just walked with them to a train station, took them on the train, and showed up at the embassy in Shenyang, and essentially called and said, "Listen, I have I have several North Koreans here who would like to seek asylum," and it was at this moment where like that decision had just been made with George W. Bush. They accepted them because they said, "Oh, I guess we have to because the policies have changed." But he never called them and asked permission in advance. He never coordinated it with the U.S. government because, of course, from a government point of view, this is like an unsustainable thing to do, and it's also dangerous diplomatically because of China's relationship with North Korea is very different, and they would not like to see North Koreans being shuttled out of the country via the embassies. So then later on, he tried to do the same thing again, not that long later, and including people who were related to the first group. He showed up again. And this time, the consulate said, "Oh, we can't take these people," and they said, "You might as well try the UNICEF in Beijing," and that's a long journey away. So they decided to try that out rather than go back to the shelter. And along the way, they were all arrested. And the U.S. government. This was kind of during Christmas that year, and the U.S. government people are having to kind of come in from their holidays to make calls to try to help them out, and they were in there for quite a while. And Adrian even went on a hunger strike at one point to try to put pressure on the Chinese government. Eventually, because of his connections, actually, they all got released, and those North Koreans were actually allowed to leave the country. But that was the last time he was able to do something like that, So, and I talked to one of these guys who runs these underground railroad networks, and they were saying that they were quite upset with how that had all went down because it caused a lot of attention to be placed on the underground railroad. And for there was more Chinese police presence around looking for who are these people that are doing this. So that's even the chapter is called, I think, "Bull in a China Shop." That was what they called him.
Right. And I can understand why people would be upset, because if they've been quietly doing this same thing, maybe not taking them to an embassy, but quietly getting people to a safe location, and all of a sudden you're doing it in a very loud way. You mentioned perfectly in your book about how someone in North Korea, their first time in China, they may never have seen a car before. It's really hard for us to picture as Westerners what life is like for someone who may not be accustomed to seeing self-opening doors or other things, electricity. And because of that, they're going to stick out already like a really sore thumb to Chinese police because they're going to look suspicious, right?
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, some of the most amazing books I've ever read have been the story of a defector starting in North Korea and making their way to wherever they ended up. I mean, that's such an inspiring genre of books. And I think I really encourage people to read those. One of the ones I really enjoyed was The Aquariums of Pyongyang. That's an older one. And then there's another one I'm forgetting right now, but it was one of the people that was related to Adrian's rescue work. Also, just so powerful, because it's really just a story. It's almost like it's kind of like a tragic adventure story, because every turn something happens, and then they end up getting set back by 3 years, and they have to try again, and they have to build back up again, to escape. And some of the accounts, Joseph Kim is the one I'm thinking of. Some of those accounts of when they arrive in China and they're trying to survive, and by luck, there's one person that really helps them out, and and gets them to the next place and to the next place. Really inspiring genre of books.
Absolutely. So the bull in the china shop kind of implodes in that way, and he's not able to directly help people get out of North Korea. Obviously, the organizations, though, continue to still move in this kind of a pseudo underground network where people are going into safety. But it doesn't stop his activism. And in fact, I would argue there's a big catalyst in the book where all of a sudden, we have the change of power of Kim Jong-il to Kim Jong-un, and we have the brother and the assassination of the brother, and how he is thrown right into this situation of essentially rescuing the one portion of the Kim family who does not want to, I guess, necessarily stay in North Korea, if I'm correct. But also, they have just lost essentially a member of their family due to the political assassination, right?
Yeah. I mean, that was the first moment when it was clear that what Adrian was building was actually, it wasn't playing around. They actually were able to do something in the world, and it was very inspiring. But essentially, Kim Jong-nam was a kind of black sheep of the family, but because of this weird and quirky system, and in a way terrible system created by Kim Il-sung, the father of Kim Jong-il, that there's a kind of almost like son king aspect of the Kim family, and this sort of fictional story about how they're almost like demigods, came from this particular mountain and could do magical things. Because of that, the black sheep still had a kind of bloodline. It's almost like a from one of these like Game of Thrones kind of TV shows or something. So he was always a danger, because if the people of North Korea believed in that sort of fantastical bloodline story, then foreign powers could sort of prop this guy up. This is in the mind of Kim Jong-un, of course. They could prop this guy up and say he's the rightful king, the rightful leader of North Korea, and undermine his power. And adding to that, Kim Jong-nam was also seems to be a paid informant to both the U.S. intelligence services as well as the Chinese intelligence services. Of course, that's another reason why they might be going after him. But when he was assassinated in Kuala Lumpur, the family of Kim Jong-nam were just by themselves, and because Adrian was never for a second not thinking about North Korea, he's met everybody. He's met all the people in those underground railroads. He's met every defector he could meet. He met the son of Kim Jong-nam at one point. And so that son, he called Adrian. That's who he called when he was in trouble, because he didn't have the number of really anyone else to call. And Adrian immediately put into action a plan, which was call people on his list to see who could help out. And it just so happened that Christopher An was on a little vacation in the Philippines. So he was the closest person in the world in the group of Adrian's friends who could get to Taipei. They decided to all meet in Taipei, in Taiwan. So it was a big moment, because it sort of put Adrian's previously completely invisible underground group a little bit on the radar, and they kind of created a website to start getting more inbound, pleas from other North Koreans and people that needed help.
Right. And so because of that, now one thing that I thought was interesting, and I'd like to hear your perspective on it, is when Christopher is with Kim Han-sol and with the other family members, it was a very tense moment. At one point, they even thought they might not be able to get out of the country. And then out of nowhere, federal agents sweep in and they kind of take him to safety. And at that point, Kim Han-sol kind of says he wasn't really rescued by Adrian, if I'm correct. Why do you think that?
Well, no, I think what happened, he didn't really say that. What happened was I think Kim Han-sol trusted Adrian and he trusted Christopher, right? Because they came and they sat with him. But neither Adrian or Christopher had any special powers. They have no governmental powers. And they had actually got agreement from the government of the Netherlands through a human rights lawyer to let them seek asylum there in the Netherlands. So that they were ready, they had a plan. But of course, like I said before, the father was like a paid informant of the CIA. And so two members of the CIA showed up, and they identified themselves as such, and they said, listen, we're here to help now and take over. And still Kim Hong-sul wanted to stay with Adrian's group and follow with the plan that they had. But what happened was they boarded the flight and with the CIA agent as their escort. And when they arrived, I think by the time they arrived, he had persuaded them that there was another way for them to leave. And there was even a report a few months ago about them being identified as being in the United States. So clearly they kind of diverted plans at that point.
Right. And I know that while they were waiting, that Kim Hong-sul did record a video thanking them for what they did. And that was really a catalyst where people said, Adrian, he really knows what he's doing. He isn't a fake. He isn't all bluff, right? And more people, including high ranking, as you were mentioning, those different tiers, those different classes at the beginning, elites even, were starting to contact him to see how they could effectively defect.
Yes, exactly. And to be honest, one of the shortcomings of this book is that this is a secret organization, and as we'll find out later on, Adrian's not an easily reachable person at the moment. There's so much work that they did that I don't even know the full details of, because I came at this as a investigative journalist using every tool I had, but that doesn't mean I could find out everything. But there's definitely many cases where they helped people either being influential people in embassy positions, but also just North Korean businessmen, other people sort of escape through a variety of means.
Right. And one person that did contact, so I guess we'll start talking a little bit about the embassy event. One person that did contact him was someone who was interested in defecting that was currently at an embassy in Madrid, Spain. Now, for me, before we just go into the embassy thing itself, some people, considering it's the Hermit Kingdom, might be surprised to know that there are North Korean embassies across the world. Now there's one in the United States, but there are over 20, I believe, across the world. Can you explain who, I know it's the elites, but who lives at these embassies and what is their main goal or responsibility to do while living there?
Yeah. So like you say, North Korea is not known for its diplomacy that you would usually do. They're not really facilitating a lot of visiting of North Korea, although it is possible to visit North Korea. It hasn't been for a long time. More recently, it's been more difficult to get there after COVID. But these embassies serve several purposes. One of them is some of them in some countries, they do things like negotiate about food aid. So for example, in Italy, it's well known that that's where a lot of the food aid negotiations happen. North Korea will never publicly say it, but they desperately live on food aid from places like the World Food Program. They also are the centers of there's no other way to put it, but criminal activity, because the North Korean government needs foreign currency and they don't have a lot of industry, except for they have sort of this slave labor kind of production of goods and cigarettes and things. But these embassies, every person in that embassy is sort of tasked with finding a way to make money that can help out the regime, and it essentially goes to the top. But so that includes things like there's been cases of cigarette smuggling, or cigarette counterfeiting. So basically proliferating fake cigarettes on the streets of European cities and then taking the profits and bringing them back. There's drug related things. There's counterfeit currency. North Korea actually is one of the greatest counterfeiters of U.S. currency in the world. They're actually really amazing at it. They do a really great job. And all kinds of things like that, and hacking, ransomware. A lot of this stuff is sort of centered at the embassies. That's where the hub of it is, even if not all the people who are doing it are living in the embassy. And then there is a little bit of diplomacy, but I don't think it's critical. It's sort of like, when you talk to people that interact with these North Korean embassies, it's sort of a bizarre experience and it doesn't really lead to a lot,
Right, absolutely. When you were talking about the different enterprises, it reminded me, I was talking a little bit about every time I was reading this, I had to keep taking breaks and find videos like other documentaries that kind of open my eyes, because you actually do talk about how, they have the labor camps, but there's also labor camps outside of Korea in other countries. And Vice has a great series for those of you watching. It's about 12 years old now, but still it's like in the middle of Siberia. And all of a sudden you're like in North Korea where they have these camps and the architecture and everything looks just like North Korea. And they're in like 10-year terms where they're having to just essentially log wood.
Yeah, yeah. And then there was even cases. I remember I used to live in Abu Dhabi, and there was a weird North Korean construction company there. And at the time we weren't able to uncover a lot about it. But later on, there's been a lot of reports about how the people that come from North Korea to work in these companies are paid nothing. They just go there and they live, and they're fed essentially. So they're not much better than indentured servants or slaves of the state that are sent over to work around the clock to build something, and then the profits, of which there are a lot because they're not paying the staff anything, just accrue to the regime. And so there's been many cases of that in Africa, and especially countries that just don't seem to be asking a lot of questions about the human rights of the workers.
Right. So back to the embassies though, because I don't want to segue too far. It's just there's so much interesting things to talk about this. Adrian was contacted by someone living at the embassy in Madrid. And as you said, there was already a defector from an embassy prior to this, correct?
Yes, and probably even more that we don't know all the details.
At least a documented one. So can you explain, because when this incident we're about to talk about was broadcast, even in international news, even in news in the United States, it was presented as a paramilitary violent organization. These people are armed and dangerous. If you find them, you might not be safe. Can you explain why it has a look, if you watch any of these video cameras or any of the surveillance of this event, as they try to rescue this embassy staffer, why it looks to be a violent event?
Yeah, and so it's important. This commercial attaché, he ran the consulate or the embassy in Madrid. He said, I want to defect and I want to bring my embassy with me. And I can do that. I can negotiate my embassy, my other people in my staff to also join us in a mass defection. So it wasn't that he was just talking about himself necessarily. There was talk of this grander ambition. But the fear in the North Korean embassy and then on Adrian's side was, how does this look to North Korea? And so there's cameras everywhere. Are those cameras live feeding footage back to North Korea? Because all of these workers, they're forced to go everywhere in twos, kind of spying on each other. In North Korea itself, you're supposed to report on each other in a public forum all the time. So they really do everything they can to make it almost like mentally impossible to defect. There are cases of it, and it's usually people that have been away so long that they were kind of able to break down those mental barriers. Anyways, they wanted to also avoid this this consequence of the 3 generations. This is a small segue, but any North Korean you will ever meet outside of North Korea is carrying a huge traumatic weight on their shoulders. And it's the weight of what happens to their family, their friends, people they used to know, anybody they once spoke to, who knows what the consequence is for those people, or could be family members that are thrown into a prison camp. And so to reduce that risk, Adrian and his team thought of something that was kind of, in a sense, brilliant, out of the box, but also highly risky. And that was essentially to make this into a movie set. They went and they bought equipment from stores that supply movie sets. So essentially, it was these very realistic guns, but they didn't fire bullets. And then they had some plastic handcuffs and things like that. And all of it was designed to make an image of a raid. So when they first entered the embassy, they needed to look like a real raid, like a real kind of attempted kidnapping or whatever. And then once they figured out the cameras and everything else, they could sort of stand down the acting. But in this case, what happened was they stormed in as planned. Everything was kind of going to plan. And they went room to room, and they were kind of gathering everyone into a central space. And then one woman clearly wasn't part of the discussion, any discussion, or hadn't been briefed on this possibility, and she truly panicked because another thing about North Korea is you're really inculcated to have a physical reaction to the idea of an American, the idea of a South Korean, the accent. Just the accent of a South Korean sends a physical bolt of fear through you, and you'll see. So what happened is she managed to escape by jumping off of a balcony. She injured herself, so she was kind of a mess, bleeding. I think she had a injured hip as well. She managed to drag herself out of a kind of a hidden door, and actually went to the embassy, and I kind of figured out where the store is. But it would be something that, unless you were really paying attention, you would never be able to figure out there was another exit. So then she went in the street, and she got to a hospital nearby, and they were trying to ask her what's going on, what's happening, and she told them, there's something horrible happening at the North Korean embassy. They're eating people in there, and that's literally what she told them. And they wrote later on, this is in the court documents, they said they were just like completely like, what's going on here? And that goes again to this idea that they're even taught that Americans and South Koreans are cannibals. That's kind of the way they treat people sometimes. I'm not saying that necessarily every North Korean is taught that, but clearly for me, that was such an alarming thing to hear. The police showed up and knocked on the door, and Adrian is like a very cool customer. He put on a little pin, the Dear Leader pin, with Kim Il Sung and Kim Jong-il on it. And he went to the front door and he pretended to be a North Korean official and told them to kind of go away. Like if they don't have an official reason to be there, they need to leave. But that kind of scenario caused the whole mood to change. And the commercial attaché just panicked, just plain panicked at that point, and thought, this isn't in control the way I wanted it to be in control. And he thought there was no safe way for it to happen. They were afraid that if they left that building, they were going to be arrested, killed, that the North Korean government was already on its way, assassins. And so Adrian and his team ultimately left, and they kind of made it out of Spain via Portugal. And but what they left behind was something that looked very bad, right? It looked on the cameras, it looked everything. And then on worse than that, it looked bad. And then also the North Korean officials had no choice but to say that it was real, right? Even though there's fake guns and everything, they had to say it was a real kidnapping. They had no idea that there was anything planned because, of course, what are they going to say? They have no choice, right? So,
right.
That's kind of a quick summary of what happened.
Absolutely. I know there's tons more detail to it. I mean, to the point where when they're panicking, when everything goes awry, some of the embassy people start actually hurting one another because they needed to make it look even more convincing that they weren't involved in a coup to try and, escape. So Adrian, obviously there were upwards of 10 people involved in the embassy. We're going to call it a rescue, but that didn't work out correctly. And some of them lived in America, some of them lived in South Korea. But when Adrian and Christopher come back to the United States, and I don't want to come off wrong, but they do kind of make a fatal error where they immediately contact the US government about the situation.
Yeah, and actually, even before they left, or even as they were on the plane, they had already sent a letter to the Spanish government saying, look, you're going to come across something that looks pretty crazy, but we wanted to just let you know kind of privately that this was what it was. And they gave some details because they knew that this didn't look right and that it could get out of hand. But Adrian also had a relationship with the FBI counterintelligence division. They had sort of knocked on his door because they saw that there's this kind of mysterious guy going, Libya and different places. And they kind of wanted to know, okay, what are you up to? Who are you? But he kept that relationship going because he wanted to have a way to share information when he had it. He wasn't an agent of the US government, but he was able to communicate with them from time to time. So what happened was they thought, to cover ourselves, to protect ourselves, we need to explain what happened to the right authorities. And of course, it would have been hard to figure this out, but in a way they were misled as well. And we should also mention that this was all happening at the worst possible time to get help from the US government, because this is right in the peak period when President Donald Trump was trying to, get the Nobel Prize, with his kind of relationship with Kim Jong-un. He thought he could like make this deal work. And so they really turned their back on anything to do with Adrian and really stepped away. But the FBI agents were actually very friendly and understanding, and they gave the impression like this is crazy, but we understand. And but what happened was the U.S. and Spain have an extradition treaty, a mutual legal assistance treaty. So everything they told the FBI ultimately was sort of given to Spain to confirm the identity of the alleged perpetrators of this attempted kidnapping. And so immediately Spain filed a proceeding and they issued an extradition request to the US. And those same FBI guys disappeared, the same ones that were saying everything is fine. And then the US Marshal Service showed up to execute the arrest warrant, you know? So they made it worse for themselves by trying to make it better. But in a sense, I can't think of a better strategy they could have employed. But perhaps by not having said anything, they could have avoided making it so clear cut. And what's also ironic is when they were leaving the embassy, they grabbed all the computers and USB sticks and stuff, the intelligence material, and they handed that over to the FBI, who took it. So obviously they were considering what they had on hand to be valuable. And that embassy, the previous person before that commercial attaché, he was important in the nuclear negotiations and programming and everything. So that embassy would have had a very interesting intelligence haul.
Right, absolutely. And it's kind of what you're saying kind of goes back to what you're talking about earlier, how some people view him as a thorn, right? And so here we are, we're getting prepared for the summit between Donald Trump and Kim Jong-un. There's a lot of pressure behind this, and all of a sudden now we have news circulating that this event could happen. Now, while I know in your book you say North Korea wasn't necessarily alarmed by this and put like pieces together, I can understand why high officials in the US government, though, would be terrified that something small, even small like this, can have large ramifications for any potential deal.
Yeah, definitely. And then also it actually hurts US-Spain relationship even because
Right.
Because actually European countries are very suspicious of US intelligence because after 9/11 there were these extraordinary renditions from the streets of Italy and places that were completely extrajudicial, like they ignored the existence of laws in those countries. And so this looked and felt from that kind of bias like, oh, here's the CIA again, once again, just like cowboys coming in here doing crazy things and pretending like it wasn't them. And so there's a deep suspicion in Spain that this was authorized action. Of course, they didn't do any research really into Adrian Hong, and they really haven't overcome that bias because actually this whole problem could be solved by Spain dropping their charges. The whole thing would just immediately dissolve and be kind of, these men would be able to live their lives again. But because they don't, that's what's happening.
Right, because no, time is going by, and Christopher Alm was the only one that's been arrested. Now there are obviously warrants. They want Adrian as well. But Christopher's the only one that's been, and it was a very emotional process to go through US courts for the extradition. I know in your book you write about how the judge was even torn about it. Many supporters for those who are trying to assist with human rights in North Korea, such as Otto Warmbier's mother, made public statements even to the judge in support of Christopher An, that he is not a terrorist, that he is someone who's just trying to do something good. Do you think if extradition, I know they're in Peel still right now, and it's been a long battle. If Christopher An is extradited back to Spain, does he, not just from a legal standpoint, but does he face potential physical threats, potentially from North Koreans who may want him for revenge or anything like that?
Well, it's hard to say exactly what threat he faces, but you can be sure that the threat is exponentially larger because in America, you will not find a North Korean embassy. You will not find proxies of North Korea in America. It's just that they are blocked from operating here, but they are active in Spain and they are active in Europe. And they have shown a willingness to use extremely cunning and terrifying techniques to assassinate people. And people often underestimate North Korea. It's kind of like that film. Some of those films have been made about North Korea, like making fun of them, but they can pull things off that are really kind of scary. And so definitely the risk increases. And his battle is it's almost it's so tragic because Christopher was in a way the least informed of the group about this plan. He showed up, he was told the whole embassy is going to defect, come along with us, we need you there. There's like a calm sort of calming presence on the mission. And then everything kind of goes awry, and when he gets back he keeps being told everything's going to be fine, including by the FBI who came to interview him. He gave them cookies, and then one day he was trying to go to Adrian's house, and the US Marshal Service are inside his house, and they arrest him, and they actually pull a gun on him, and they held the gun to him, thinking that he was armed and dangerous. I mean, obviously they didn't know much about the backstory, but he was thrown into a Los Angeles jail thinking, oh, this is all gonna be taken care of, like tonight, I'll be home for dinner tonight. Instead, he stayed in jail, and really had to live in jail for a significant period of time. Eventually he got out of jail, but even then it was a house arrest that was so strong that he couldn't leave the front door. And this appeal process is, I mean, he's actually a very, he still maintains the kind of upbeat demeanor, but his life has been really destroyed by this, and it's affected his family and his wife. He can't really work. People Google him and they think that he's involved in something nefarious, but he really was just the guy that was there to keep things calm. So I mean, that's painful to hear his story, and I almost feel guilty putting him through it, because I've asked him to go through it with me so many times. But I've come to the conclusion that it's a true injustice what he's facing, and it's also a true injustice, even Adrian as the kind of mastermind, what he's facing, because he's been at that exact moment when the US Marshals were there, he disappeared, and so he has been on the run, completely disappeared, and ever since then.
Right, and there have been articles written about him subsequent after this after the incident, published like in the New Yorker and things like that, that really say like he's off the grid completely. I mean, he's probably, as we talked about before this program, somewhere living in the United States, but very off the grid. And in today's world, that's harder and harder to do. I'd like to end on one question, because there was one quote that Adrian told you in your book that you wrote verbatim that really stuck with me. And he told you that sometimes it is better to watch people than expose them. And I'm torn on that, because I feel that you writing, for example, this book is really providing an understanding as well as a level of awareness to this overall very sad situation. What were your thoughts when Adrian told you that statement?
Well, he said that actually at the time, it was more about, they had information as a group and they could have exposed it in the press or in other ways, but instead they were watching. And it really went to the idea that he had an ambition that was so crazy that they could actually take on the North Korean regime itself. And they had a kind of remarkable forays into that, including spray painting on the embassy in Kuala Lumpur, and even the flag inside the Kuala Lumpur embassy was changed to the Free Joseon flag, creating this government in exile, having blueprints for what to do when the Kim regime fell. And so that's why he was less interested in just doing the conventional thing. You find a guy, you find a person that's smuggling oil into North Korea, rather than expose him, you kind of find a way to use him as one part of your strategy to take down the regime. And so I think that is the thing about him that will always be very polarizing, because most people have a kind of a sensor in their body that says this is going too far or that's too risky. And someone like Adrian was such a risk taker, and in a way he recklessly brought other people into danger too, whether it's North Korean defectors in that case in China, or members of his own group in this particular mission, and the people who lived in that embassy. But it's all motivated by this idea that what the goal here is to improve human life of North Koreans, and it's such a huge number that it demands a more aggressive response. Now, I would never say Adrian never like played around with actual violence. It was never on the cards, but he was willing to do quite ambitious things. And so that's how I look at that comment. The other one that stuck with me was he had this comment. He's actually kind of interested in business. We mentioned in the book he has this electronic scooter business at one point. A lot of his businesses were set up to help him fund his North Korea work. But he said to me once, that he sees it all as like every company, and including his group, it's just a bunch of people get together in a room and make a decision to try it and to put their energy into it. And he really had an enormous amount of faith that a group of ordinary people in the size of a classroom could really make a big difference. And I always found that very inspiring thought. You know, that was one of the motivating things for me to that helped me pursue this story.
Right. And, because at the end of the day, these weren't superheroes or anything like that. These were just average people who had an interest, something they wanted to do, something they felt was right. As you said, simply buying plane tickets for people who needed an escape. And it's a sad story about how the snowballed from, his level of activism to where it kind of implodes because it just grew too big and it wasn't well thought out. And it was just too much, especially on a global foreign policy scale. So I highly encourage, because we really only scratched the surface. There's so much more detail in this book. I would highly recommend everyone pick up a copy of The Rebel and the Kingdom. Bradley, for people who want to continue following you in your work and your books, how would you recommend people follow you?
You can follow me on Twitter. I'm fairly active in promoting things like that. And in my company, Project Brazen, we're doing a lot of ambitious nonfiction investigative projects. We have a big one coming out on Monday about this amazing scandal with the King of Spain and what kind of the corruption and hidden money that led to his downfall. But yeah, those are two good ways, I guess.
And I did listen to your podcast episode with Christopher, and it was kind of nice to hear his own reflection and his own words about what has happened and how it's impacted his life. And so even if people are just looking for more of a snapshot look into this event, I'd highly recommend checking it out and hearing it from the source. So Bradley, I'd like to thank you so much. I know it's a late night over there.
Thank you.
And I just thank you so much for the book. Thank you for joining us tonight. And please take care. Thank you everybody else who tuned in tonight.
Thank you.